Today is November 14th, 2023. My name is Maggie Rivas Rodriguez. I'm interviewing Edgar Sandoval for the Voces of a Pandemic Oral History Project for the Voces Oral History Center at UT Austin. Edgar, thank you again so much for agreeing to be interviewed. Just so you know, I'm going to kind of give you a little bit of background on this. The physical interview that we do for you about you, with you, is going to be housed at the Nettie Lee Benson Latin American Collection on the UT campus. You're gonna decide whether you want that pre-interview form we just filled out, if you would want that part of your public file. And if you do, we will strip out the personal information and we'll just put a printout of that pre-interview form in your public file. If you say no, we'll just have it internally for our own database. The other thing to ask you about is this interview is going to be on our website for the Voices of a Pandemic YouTube site. And the other thing we're going to be doing is the answers that you give me are going to be woven into a book chapter about the pandemic experience for Latinos and Latinas across the country. Okay. So I'm going to start to ask you a little bit about your coverage, but also because you were not only an observer in this case, you also were affected by this. So there's going to be a mixture of questions back and forth. If at any point you need to stop to get a drink of water or, whatever, just let me know, because that raw tape is going to be housed at the Benson. The other thing is that sometimes people get lulled into a little bit of a sense of feeling a lot of confianza with the person who's interviewing them. So just remember that this interview is going to be on the web, so that it's going to be available for your friends, your family, your employer to see. So we just want you to be mindful of that, so that you're
going to edit it, or will it be published?
We generally do not edit. It's the raw interview that gets put on there. We'll put a slate on the front that gives the basics of the date and who is being interviewed. But then the raw recording is what goes on the web and also what goes in the archive. Okay. So let me ask you this: when did you become aware of the pandemic?
I mean, in 2020, I was living in New York, so New York City was the first city that really started seeing the effects of the pandemic in the United States. So pretty early on, I mean, I remember I was in the police bureau of the New York Times in February when we learned that the city was shutting down, which was unprecedented, right? It's the biggest city in the country, bustling metropolis, just the idea of shutting down, it was just inconceivable. So in February, I believe the governor announced that. And then in March, the city was a complete ghost town. It was just a surreal experience. So we learned about the pandemic before the rest of the country and lived it. We experienced it.
How did that affect your work?
It was challenging. I mean, I was assigned to the police bureau, so we mostly focus on local crime, policing. But pretty soon after that, everyone in the news kind of became a COVID reporter, because that's what was happening in New York, especially. So we had to do what we always did. We just put on your mask on and go out to report stories. I remember one of the first stories I wrote was about the first man in Queens who became infected. Because we reported on the first people in Manhattan, which is the most dense populated area in the city. So it was going to be natural that people were going to be infected there. But I remember that Queens, this neighborhood only had one hospital, and they were really overwhelmed. And this is early on when becoming infected was still kind of like a news event. So we found out there was one person who went to the hospital in Queens, and I managed to track him down and interview him. He was I believe a taxi Uber driver who met me. And then I got sick shortly afterward. So I'm not sure if that, I mean, we were, pretty far apart. And at that time, he'd been released from the hospital already. But I don't know if I became infected on the subway or, on the streets or during the interview. I just know that a few days after my interview, I started showing symptoms of COVID.
Were you did you have access to N95 masks?
We did pretty early on. The newsroom basically dropped in the newsroom a bunch of supplies, including masks, gloves, N95 mask, everything that we needed. So I went to the newsroom and I grabbed a bunch of stuff that before the interview. And I remember I had I had a regular mask, I had an N95 mask on me, I had gloves. So I looked like a nurse or, like a doctor in the subway. And people were still looking at me kind of strange because people just had a mask or a cloth mask. Nobody was really wearing that kind of level of PPO, as that we came to call it. So yeah, I had all the necessary, tools that I needed. And I hopped in the subway to the Rockaways, which is a pretty long ride. And I found a man and he talked to me about what it was like to experience COVID, when it was still pretty early on and we didn't know what the symptoms were, what they meant, and what it was like to survive, a new pandemic back then.
Were you living by yourself at the time?
No, I was living with a roommate and he never got sick. So it just goes to show, right? I mean, that now that I know, if he never shows symptoms, and in New York, because of the prices of the apartments, everybody has a roommate. If you can be like 35 years old or 60, but everybody has to have a roommate. So it was a fairly small apartment. And we tried to use different cups, different utensils and stay 6 feet from each other, but it's still a small place. And he never became infected, so that was good.
Did your newspaper send out like instructions to everybody that this is what they want everybody to do to take care of themselves?
Yeah, I mean, this is pretty early on, like I said, so we knew what we knew. But yeah, I mean, everybody was encouraged to use the necessary equipment, tools to stay safe. But we were told you're not comfortable going to the streets or going to a hospital or even people that you don't have to expose yourself. So we were given a choice. I'm just used to being the reporter in the field. I think I would go crazy if I'm just home. I just have the inclination to always like head out the door with my notepad and report the story. And so I just decided to take a risk, I guess. I didn't really realize how big of I guess, when this is the first time we're experiencing a pandemic of this kind. So you really don't know what the repercussions can be, you just kind of go on how you usually operate.
When did that become evident to you?
When I started feeling sick, and it's just at a time with the hospitals in New York were overwhelmed, so you could not even get tested. We were just told only call the hospital if you're out of breath, if you're short of breath. If you walk to the kitchen and you find yourself you can't breathe, then call the hospital. Otherwise, we can't test you, we can't treat you. Please don't call us. Basically, that was the message on everywhere. So, I was kind of in denial. I said, maybe it's a cold, maybe it's a flu, and just every day you wake up and there was no medicine over the counter that can help you. We were like months away from a vaccine anyway at that point. So you just wake up every day and hope that you get better. And for me, it felt like a moderate flu. I was always able to function. And I mean, I was working during the whole week. I never took time off because I didn't know what it was. I just thought, maybe, but when I had symptoms, I never left my house. I stayed home for that week, just working over the phone and my computer. It wasn't until May when things started getting a little bit better that I went to get an antibody test because at that point I already had recovered from the symptoms. And then that's when I learned that it was indeed COVID what I had.
Because you had built so much antibodies at that point.
So they could see that I was infected recently. And that's kind of a relief. Like, okay, I survived it. It's already behind me. So I have some sort of antibody protection for at least for, I don't know, a year or a few months.
Did you start using Zoom right away or some other teleconferencing program?
Yeah, we started using, I use Google Meet a lot, which is basically like Zoom for Google. It was still kind of new back then because we never used really Zoom or Google Meet before. So you kind of got used to doing everything via your computer or your phone.
How did you learn how to do that?
I still haven't. I mean, it's kind of I like more person contact, being in front of a person. I think that it goes a long way. It was kind of surreal just seeing everybody's faces on these little boxes in the computer, and knowing when to interact with people, when it's your turn to talk. But yeah, you just gotta adapt. Human beings are pretty adaptable, and that was something we all had to learn how to cope with.
So when you were in New York, were you worried about your family? Because I guess your family still lives, some of them live in the Valley.
Right, I was worried, but we had in March and April, the COVID kind of stayed in New York. It wasn't really spreading everywhere else at that time. I think they were more worried about me at that time. And I think it was over the summer when we started hearing that cities outside New York were seeing a surge in COVID infections. And I think that in the border, it was around late June and July in the summer that they started seeing this like skyrocket number of COVID infections. So it gradually spread to the rest of the country.
When did you leave New York?
So I left for the first time in a while. That's summer of 2020 when I went to work to Texas to cover the pandemic. But I moved to San Antonio a year later, 2021.
So the decision for you to go down to the Valley, you went to the Valley to cover the pandemic, is that right?
Right. So in that summer, the reporters in the national desk were pretty exhausted. They had been covering the pandemic around the country. We were too in New York, but in New York, you have colleagues who can fill in. It's one newsroom covering a city. The national reporters to cover the entire country. So the Texas reporter, we only had one reporter in Texas, so he was pretty exhausted. So they made a call out to the rest of us and say, hey, we need volunteers. We need people in this states, Texas, Oklahoma, I forget which states they were needing help for. But I saw Texas and I said, well, I'm from Texas. I can go to the border and cover the pandemic. And I started seeing that the numbers in the Valley were getting pretty high. So I raised my hand and I said, I'll go to the Valley. I can cover that part of the country that I'm familiar with.
Would you be living with your family? Was that the idea, that you'd be living there with them?
No. I'm San Antonio 4 hours away. But even when I went to cover the pandemic or any assignment, I just stay at a hotel and especially then, because when I flew to the Valley, the border, as we call it, I didn't know who was infected quite yet, so I just booked a hotel ahead of time. And it's good to have your own working space,
Yeah. So did you say that your family got sick? Did family members contracted as well? I think I remember
Yeah,
that.
so when I went to the border, I didn't know they were sick yet. I was gonna go and find stories
Right.
along the border, right? That was the initial idea. But just as I was packing my bag, one of my sister texted me, and she said that she particularly said, I think in a quote, the Sandovales are all getting sick or are sick. And I kind of I thought she was joking at first. I didn't really realize she was being serious. And then I spoke and she said, well, we don't know if it's COVID, but everyone is showing symptoms that could be COVID. And then when I got in the plane, I said, well, maybe it's something else, let's see how this plays out. And then when I landed, the number of people who had symptoms had doubled. So by the time I got to the Valley, there were about 16 family members who were infected, or people they were exposed to during this small period of time.
And I don't remember, I'm sorry, Edgar, I don't remember this. I remember reading the story back then, but I did not look it up right before this meeting. Were any of your family members hospitalized with COVID?
Everyone was infected and diagnosed eventually, but only my mother was hospitalized. She ended up going to the ICU. She was feeling pretty ill. My mother had just recovered from cancer like a few months before. She literally went in remission in February and then got COVID that summer. So her body was just recovering from chemotherapy, So when I was there on assignment, I was checking on her every day. We would just knock on the door and look through the window, through the door, because you don't know if you can get infected again. And then one day she said she was short of breath when I was there. And then I went to buy one of the small monitors that you put in your finger. I forget what they're called. And then the reading said 80 slash something else, right? And I thought, well, 80, that's, for me, 80 is like getting a B in a test, right? It's pretty, it seemed pretty like a high number. It wasn't 69 or 40. And one of my cousins is a doctor in California. So I sent him a picture, say, hey, what does this mean? Is this 2/3 of a lung capacity is good? He said, no, that number is horrible. He said, everything below 90, you have to go to the hospital. So yeah, so we just called all the hospitals, we called the doctors that we knew, and one doctor said, yeah, bring her to this hospital. She needs to be admitted right away. And sure enough, we went to the hospital and it was chaos. I mean, there was people waiting in the waiting room. And at that point we didn't know officially that it was COVID. We thought it was COVID, but tests was still in short supply. So when she was tested in the hospital, it became official. Like, it wasn't a shock for us. We kind of knew it was COVID, but then she had to be taken away right away to an ICU to get air and other treatment.
So what month would that have been?
That was summer of 2020. It was July. And that was when the county judge was kind of like going on the news every day and saying our numbers are getting pretty high. They were breaking records of the number of infected basically every day. The funeral homes were overwhelmed. I mean, they couldn't fit all the people that were dying. A lot of the people had to have, in the valley, in the border, especially next to Tamaulipas, Mexico, and Texas, people like to have like this long funerals, where you have like the rosaries, sometimes it lasts for 9 days. Well, they couldn't do any of that. They had to like process people pretty quickly and then just bury them. So that was that same period when the funerals were overwhelmed. Hospitals didn't have capacity. It's only like 4 hospitals in the valley anyway, the big ones, so they were all pretty much overwhelmed. So we were lucky that we got a room and that she was able to get care, because a lot of people were waiting.
How long was she in the hospital, Edgar?
She was in the hospital for a couple of weeks. And it was like, sometimes we would speak over FaceTime, when we could. And she was always covering an oxygen mask and in the ICU, and sometimes the doctor would call me and say, one day person can feel pretty healthy, the next day they collapse, the next day they feel better. That was the case with my mom. And like some days she couldn't even talk and she was out of it, and some days she felt like she could communicate with us. And you never know. The doctor told us that some people feel great one day and the next day they pass away. You just couldn't tell. So it was kind of a touch and go for a lot of people, not just my family.
So when your family was going through this, were you still reporting, like full-time reporting, full on? Because there was so much going on at the same time.
Yeah, I was still reporting, and I told my editors, like, this is happening, just so you know, in case I have to take some time off work, And they said, yeah, take care of your family first. But they said, can you write about this? And I said, well, let me make sure that everyone's okay. And then I can perhaps write about it. I was interviewing other families who were going through the same thing or similar experiences. I was talking to doctors, county officials. So I had all that reporting in my notepad. And then when my mom went home and I said, okay, I think I can feel like I can write about this. I couldn't write about other people and then just ignore what was happening in my own family, right? It wouldn't be like fair to the community that I'm writing about how they're one person infected an entire cluster and then the same thing happened to me. Because in my family, what happened was that my nephew started having symptoms. And then my mother had a doctor appointment in Houston to follow up on her cancer prognosis. So of course, Mexican Americans, you know how we are, 2 families in 2 cars driving to the same doctor appointment. And on the way back, they switch cars, so how it is, people just switch cars to get more leg room. So of course, everyone and people in those cars got infected. And then they came home and they saw other family members, and whoever they came in contact with also became infected. So that's what the number grew to 16. And after that story came out, my nephew and I went on CNN, and there were the interviews about the article, and he was I mean, he wanted to do the interview because he wanted to warn people that don't take your symptoms, lightly, that they could be, learn from my experience, basically. So the anchor, I remember the anchor called him patient zero, and he was like, yeah, I was patient zero. What can I say? He was only like 19 back then. So he was a pretty brave young man to kind of like share his experience and warn people that, this could happen to them too.
So Edgar, when did you become aware of kind of the outsized effects on Latinos? When did that become evident to you?
Yeah, I mean, so when I went to the border before my family got sick, or as they got sick, it was kind of evident right away. I mean, everyone in the valley was getting infected. Not everyone, but a lot of people were getting infected. And I talked to local officials, like, why is this happening in this community? And he says, because Latinos cannot stay away from each other. Even though there was a pandemic happening, people were still having barbecues in their backyard. They thought we could be in the backyard, we're in the open air, might be a little bit safer, but still, like, the tias and the abuelas showed up, and the cousins, and it was the culture of pachangas, or gatherings, the local officials were pointing to, and they were saying, please stop gathering with each other. At the same time, it's difficult because that in some of the border communities, Latinos tend to live under the same roof. 3 generations of families can live on the same roof. You have the grandma living there with the aunt, sometimes and cousins. So unlike the mainstream, we tend to live together in bigger numbers than other groups. So that's why it was also very difficult to avoid infection.
So how many because some of the stories that you did about like the funeral homes and um that was such powerful testimony, and I'm wondering, were those how did you find those stories? But it seems like there's stories everywhere you looked. There was just stories.
Yeah, I mean, there were stores everywhere you looked. It was pretty evident that just when you watch local news and hear the local officials talk about what's happening at the time, they were telling us the funeral homes are overwhelmed, the hospitals are overwhelmed. So I called a lot of funeral homes in the area, and I interviewed some over the phone. They were so busy I couldn't get them on the phone, actually. And then I spoke to a gentleman who lived I forget what city now, in the valley. But I asked him, do you mind if I can stop by the funeral home and talk to you in person? And he said, as a matter of fact, my uncle who died of COVID has a funeral tomorrow here at his own funeral home. And I said, well, do you mind if I pay my respects and attend? He said, yeah, of course, come on over. So he was nice enough. And of course, I went with my 2 masks and a shield and my gloves, because just imagine being in a funeral home where everyone being brought in died because of COVID. So I spent a day with him, and he was just overwhelmed, just like the phone was ringing every 5 minutes. People were coming in, old, young, middle age, all ages. He had to expand the back room where they keep the bodies because they didn't have enough capacity. They had to create new shelves. So he was really kind enough to share his experience with us, and that became one of the articles.
So working with photographers, I think that most of them were New York Times photographers. Is that correct?
Right. Yeah, so the New York Times doesn't have staff photographers. They hire freelancers, but we work with people who regularly work for us. So I believe the gentleman that photographed the stories, his name was Tamir Khalifa, who's worked with me pretty closely on Uvalde. So we kind of like became friends because we're just so used to covering these horrible tragedies side by side. And now he's covering the Gaza-Israel conflict. So there's no shortage of tragedies.
Yeah. So when you're working with photographer, how do you all manage that during the pandemic? How do you all do you go together to the assignments? Are there things that you I'm trying to get a picture of what it's like to work with a photographer
Mhm.
during this?
Yeah, you're gonna become partners. You want the same images, basically, him for the photos and me to describe. So I tried to either ride with them on the same car. That was during the pandemic, so we couldn't do that. So we just meet at a certain point, and then we just follow each other to the assignment. And we're side by side, basically. We're like, think about it like buddy detectives, right? They're investigating the same crime. That's the kind of partnership that you have to develop sometimes. So we were side by side, just going to all kinds of places. And there was a different photographer that I worked with. We went through an ICU in Rio Grande City, which is in Stark County, next to McAllen. So him and I went into the hospital, to the ICU, no less. And this is a pretty rural hospital in a more rural county. So they literally had to like expand the ICU and make their own walls out of cardboard, just to show how rudimentary they had to, the setup was. They had to like be spontaneous on the spot and come up with their own, um, create their own rooms basically to treat people and keep them away from the general population. So yeah, we had to like trust each other and then agree that you are facing some risk when you're doing this kind of reporting. Not only going into funeral homes, but going into hospitals where they're the epicenter of a pandemic. And we were at the ICU. People were literally dying in front of us. I mean, there were doctors caring for patients, and then they said this person just passed away. And they couldn't find, or there were people who were getting really ill as well, and they need to fly them out to a bigger hospital because they only have so many supplies and resources. So we were trying to call helicopters, and they just couldn't find anyone to transport people to San Antonio or Houston or Oklahoma, whoever would take him. Yeah.
So can you think of any anecdotes about covering that when you started to because I know that the fact that you speak Spanish allowed you to connect with people in a way that you never would have been able to do otherwise. Can you think of an instance when that was really something that you knew that was the case?
I think more than speaking Spanish, is speaking Spanglish. In the border, people like in San Antonio, is still pretty. People still speak Spanish and English. But when you go to McAllen, Texas, it's automatic. People just start. You go to the supermarket, and then people switch English to Spanish with so much ease. So, for example, when I went to the funeral home, there was a family coming over to prepare services for their loved one, and they allowed me to witness that exchange. And they were talking to each other in Spanglish, right? So the lady was talking about her mom. She said, I want her to wear this beautiful dress we bought for her, y la peinas to the side, and then we want these flowers, right? So they were just exchanging. It really is its own language in the border with Mexico and Texas. Um, so if you're not familiar with that concept and that like fast rhythm in which people speak both languages, that you might get lost. But I'm familiar with it, so and comfortable with Spanglish. So I think having that knowledge really helped.
How about you being Latino? Do you think that if you had not had, you had not been of the same, raza, that they would have opened up to you as quickly?
I don't know, to be honest, because I know there were other reporters who were not Hispanic who were doing great work. My photographer Tamir Khalifa, he's from Israel, and people open up to him pretty well. I'm sure it doesn't hurt, that people hear and see someone that looks like them. It might be a little bit comfortable, but there are some reporters who sometimes may not be able to open those doors, even though they're Hispanics. I think it's on a case by case basis, but it hasn't hurt me. I think I can say that. Having said that, there were some families who would not want to participate in my articles, no matter my ethnicity, and my accent. So, but I
Why was
think
that?
I'm sorry.
Why was that?
Some people just don't want to participate. It's just I think I see that in any kind of story. Being a mass shooting or a protest. Some people just don't want to you know um, be part of an article. Like even for this article, it was hard for me to find people who would go on the record and share their stories, because it was still kind of a stigma to get infected, by COVID. And it was still like seen as quote unquote is your fault, like you expose yourself, you exposed your grandma, your aunt. So I had to convince people this is, to educate people about what's happening and how it happened. So I remember like it was one family I interviewed at length in that article about my family, and it took some convincing. It wasn't automatic. I think people read our articles and they say, "Oh my God, everyone's talking. It's so great," but people don't realize that for every person that we interview, we get 10 no's, in a row, and then some person would say yes. People just see the end result, and that's fine, because we're not here to tell how difficult our jobs are. They're here to read our stories. That's it, and to learn the facts and other people's relatable anecdotes.
Um, I'm glad you brought that up because I tell my students that all the time.
Mhm.
So one of the stories that you did was about immigration and how the pandemic had affected immigration. Were there particular challenges in covering that story?
I mean, it was because going to Mexico and coming back is always, during the pandemic, it's risky. Um, just personally, you don't want to cross to Mexico and end up sick there, because they're also overwhelmed with their hospitals. And they're still, a poorer country, so they may not have all the resources that a hospital in McAllen might have. So just being, and you also never know if you cross to Mexico and do some reporting, you never know when you may fall ill. You know what I mean? We're not invincible. So just having that in the back of your mind, just being conscious about your symptoms, and everyone that's coming up, crossing to the border and into the U.S. You don't know if someone is also, carrying symptoms, or being sick.
Wasn't the border closed for a period?
It was closed for a period, for legal traffic, but it's always people who've been crossing. Yeah. But yeah, I think the bridge was closed for official. Americans could always go back and forth. They were never banned from crossing to the U.S. But I think like the people who come to McAllen to shop and all kinds of stuff, they were like not allowed to come for a while.
So you saw basically your people uh there in lots of different situations. At, did you come away with a different understanding because as a Latino covering Latinos, did you draw any new insights into what it is to be Latino in the US?
In which way? If you can elaborate,
Well,
just.
so if we all kind of carry this like this idea of this is what it is to be a Latino in the US. And then you see Latinos going through a particularly challenging time. And it can either be that you have a new idea. You had said earlier that the thing about we love our pachangas, uh, either a new appreciation for the strength or for the position that so many of us got into trouble because we were essential workers and because we may not have had access to N95 masks and all that stuff. So there were a lot of societal kind of fault lines that were exposed or more exposed because of the pandemic. And I'm just wondering if it made you sit back and think about what it is to be a Latino in the US through the lens of the pandemic.
I think all of the above. I think, like I said, like Latinos have this um, cultural appreciation where we can be away from each other. So I think like the culture of pachangas that I mentioned earlier, and living in the same household, different generations. I think it's just, yeah, it's difficult for people to be away from each other. And when someone is sick, like when someone goes to the hospital, everyone has to go to the hospital, and the hospital room is full of people, you know. And in this case, that's the opposite of what you should be doing. You should be as away from each other. So I think that's more difficult for Latinos than for other groups, I believe. Because I reported on the pandemic in New York, and I covered the pandemic and like in Black and white neighborhoods, and it wasn't as a big issue for them as it was for Latinos. There's something about Latinos where we live, if we don't live in the same house, we live in the same block, you know, in the same town. And you know, the government was telling people, the local government was telling people to work from home, but most people don't work, and a lot of people don't work in white collar jobs. I wouldn't say most, but a big group doesn't. So they had to go to work. There, you can't wait tables from your apartment or your house, you know. And even if you stay home, you're going to stay home with a lot of other people who are supposed to be home. So either way is a difficult position. But yeah, the Rio Grande Valley is kind of a blue collar community. People go work in the fields and stores and schools and hospitals. So staying home wasn't really an option.
So I know you must have consumed a lot of other news media during this period. Were there stories that you think that the news media kind of in general kind of missed at the beginning about Latinos, or things that you think they could have done better or that they did a really good job on?
At the time, I was mostly reading like local press, like the local papers and McAllen and the TV stations. And I mean, I it's a different lens because for them, the culture of pachangas is kind of a given. It's like explaining something people already know. So they didn't really touch on that too much because it was just fact of life. But because I'm writing for a national audience, I have to explain to people um, the differences of this community versus other communities. So I didn't really read to be at the time. Like I know you just don't have time. You're just running around trying to get information and following them on time. But I think we were all trying just to learn. You know, it's like we were flying the plane and building it at the same time. You know, all of us in the media. So we were all trying to do our best, I think.
So you interviewed people, but can you buy the New York Times in these little towns?
You can no, it was mostly online. I showed the articles online, and you can read them that way, but it was hard to find the New York Times. I remember when my family's article came out, it made the front page, which is still kind of a big deal. So I went everywhere to look for it, and I said, well, the airport must have them. They have newspaper stands. And I called Barnes and Nobles, you know, the bookstores. Nobody had a copy of the New York Times. Nobody sold it. So I went to the airport and I went to the lady and I said, hey, do you have the New York Times? She's like, oh, yeah, we have it. We have the New York. She gave me a copy of the New Yorker magazine. And I said, no, I want the New York Times. So at first she got me excited because, you know, I thought, okay, but I finally have a copy of the New York Times with me. And it was a different New York outlet. So no, it's very difficult, but, you know, we live in a world where digital is a priority, you know. The New York Times has something like about 9 million subscribers, and most of them are online. I think less than a million are print. So really, everyone just consumes media through online now. And everyone, when I wrote the article, I just kind of wrote it and filed it, and I don't think it was going to become such a big deal, but it went viral, and anybody and my Facebook groups were sharing it, and on Twitter. And I remember I was just laying down because I was kind of tired from that ordeal, and my phone just started blowing up. You know, my Twitter notifications just started like beeping nonstop, and I even got a notification saying you're getting more than unusual notifications, but you like to silence your phone. Twitter alerted me of that. Some prominent people were tweeting it, and it just went crazy. And some of the comments that I got were a little bit judgmental. Some were positive, you know. Some were just blaming ourselves for getting infected and infecting other people, and some were like, you know, supporting getting better messages. And my poor family, I didn't even, because, you know, as soon as they recover, I was reporting the article to the whole ordeal. And then the night before, I didn't even know it was gonna run. We edited a story, and I said it's gonna run tomorrow. You know, we need COVID coverage, so it's gonna run the next day. And we were just having dinner in the kitchen. I said kind of casually, there's a story tomorrow that I'm writing, and you guys are going to be part of it. That's all I told them. So they didn't, and then they didn't know they were the story, not just part of it, you know. But I didn't know how to. It's because even though I wrote about them, it's not something that you kind of speak openly about, you know, with your family. Like, by the way, you're going to be in the paper. So I kind of took the photos from Facebook quietly, and I sent it to the photo editor. But you know, they don't read the New York Times, so they didn't make much of it, right? So my mom is resting the next day watching Univision, and then her photo comes up on TV, and she kind of gets startled. And then her phone rings, and a lady says, "Comadre, está la tele. Um, you're on TV." So even though they knew the article was coming, it still kind of took them by surprise that I was. And then Univision wanted to, which is the largest Spanish language channel in the U.S. With Telemundo. They wanted to interview me. So they have a TV show called Digital News, I think it was called. So I thought digital just means it's going to be online only. That's what digital means for me, right? So I'm in my hotel room in McAllen, and I'm doing the interview, and they're showing I get my family's photos. I didn't realize it was a live show that also aired on Univision, not just digital. So they're watching me live also, and they're kind of like, they just roll with it, you know what I mean? They went with it at that point. This is a time where everyone was on the news for contacting COVID or died because of COVID. So they decided as part of like, we're all going through this together, right? This is not just unique to us. It's happening. Like we had neighbors that passed away because of COVID. You know, my mom had a coworker that died the same week. So it was happening all around all of us.
What does your mom do for a living?
At that time, she was a janitor at La Jolla School District. And she retired that year because she couldn't just work anymore. So, you know, being a janitor is pretty difficult work. You know, you have to carry cleaning supplies. So she just couldn't do it anymore.
And how about your dad? What does he do?
My dad has been retired from welding. Yeah, for a while.
So your family didn't know they were going to be the subject of the story. I hadn't picked up on that. I didn't, you know, until you just said it. I thought that they kind of like, because you must have been taking notes while this was all going on, right?
Listen, I kind of wrote it a memory because it was the first person article, really. You know, when these things happen, I'm taking notes on my phone, you know, but they're not really. I'm not in reporter mode when this is happening. You know, I'm just like on my phone, I go to open an email in a draft. I'll write like what somebody said or description of what I'm seeing, and then I save the folder for later. But it wasn't like with a notepad saying, "How do you feel about now? What are you thinking?" You know. So I just told them that they were going to be part of an article. And, you know, at the beginning, I'm giving you inside information, but they were not going to be the first paragraph of the story. It was going to be the other family. And that's how we edited it. Because I feel like, you know, my family should be part of it, but I don't want to be the story. So the story was kind of edited that way. But when it got to the very top, one of the editors said, no, this story is the reporter's family. So it was like a very last minute switch. We just kind of copy and pasted paragraphs. Nothing was really changed. But that's why I didn't realize it was going to be, we were going to be the main story until the 11th.
But when it came out, you did know ahead of time before it was published that y'all were going to be the lead.
Yeah, I did. Yes, that was the night before. So that's when I told them that they were going to be part of the article. But you know, yeah, at that point, I think that they actually went to bed, so they didn't realize they were going to be the top. So when the story came out, I knew, but they learned after they woke up the next day, and I told them, "Oh, here you go. You guys are actually the main subjects."
So Edgar, I've got to tell you, and I'm taking off my objective hat on this, but I've got to tell you that all your coverage during that period just made me so happy, because I saw that the stories about the common people and the folks that are the ones that were most affected were being written in a way that they were not the other. And having them just this is what these, this is what people are going through. And I think that your vantage point, I don't think anybody else could have done it, but somebody who's of that, of that, of that culture, of that community. So, I've got to tell you, I really did appreciate your reporting on that. And particularly that story, because I think that story was probably the one that, well, it was a front page story, but I think it was also the one that really did seem to present the Latino experience in a way that was it was relatable to anybody. I don't know.
Well, thank you for those kind words. I guess for me, it's kind of a natural way of reporting. I didn't at the moment, at least, I just wrote it through my own filter. But I could see, yeah, I mean, I could see how having that perspective is important, which is why it's important to have diverse newsrooms, right? So we can tell the stories to the mainstream, because I think it does help to have that familiarity and sensibility, and not have that otherness. It's just, we're part of this fabric of the United States, and this is happening here, but it's not, the other. And I think we can all relate to families, we can all relate to, especially to moms. We all have a mom, or someone who raises a mom. So
Yeah. So tell me if I'm missing this, but it seems like this, particularly the pandemic coverage, gave you a visibility as a journalist that you would not have had otherwise, or that it would have taken you longer, but it definitely put you in that place where your work was being read almost every single day. Am I right on that?
yeah, I mean, before this, I was working for the New York Daily News, which is a paper in New York City read by New Yorkers. So it was kind of a local big city coverage. And the New York Times does have a national, what do you call it? A national lens, So when that story ran, it was the first time I was writing for the national desk. And everyone took notice, from people in power to the common person, from all walks of life, teachers, politicians, doctors. And I think a lot of people could relate to it at the same time. So it did. It was kind of I'm used to being a journalist I've been doing this for 20 years. I'm used to being a reporter, but it kind of made me by surprise a little bit as well, the attention. And I had a lot of interview requests, and I think I only did a handful, because I had to say, okay, I'm not gonna, there's too many interviews to do. I wanted people to read the story, and I wanted to share what I was learning, but it became a little overwhelming even for me. So I turned down a lot of the interviews.
So when did you join the Times?
The New York Times, I joined the New York Times in 2000. It was a slow progression. So I was a freelance for the New York Times for a year in 2018. And then they offered me a contract, which means you're basically an employee but don't have benefits. That's 2019. And then I was hired in 2020 as a staff reporter for the Metro desk of the New York Times. And then I came to the border, wrote those stories, and then I was promoted to the national desk. So it was kind of like a fast ascent to a big news group. But also it was kind of like an unexpected trajectory, because, like I said, I was with the Daily News for more than 10 years. And in 2018, there was like this just massive layoff in the newsroom. So half the newsroom was let go. It was a time where newspapers were really struggling. The Daily News was really especially hurt by the lack of a subscription. So a lot of us were let go, and that's when I started freelancing for the New York Times. So if I had planned a career path where I end up at the New York Times, this would never been it, If I had planned it would never happen this way. So it's just how life turned out.
Very good. Is there anything I haven't asked you that you would like to add, or that if as a reporter, you would have asked?
No, I just hope there's not another pandemic that we have to cover like this. I hope this is it for our lifetime. So we'll knock on wood, and we'll see.
Well, thank you so much. I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, Maggie.